Thank you. So good afternoon, everybody. And it's always great to be at this, I call it the boutique hepatitis conference. It's small, it's dynamic, it's very well organized. So thanks again to the team for organizing and inviting us. So I'm not going to talk about the specifics of the hepatitis B guidelines. They're not yet launched, but I'm going to give you a sort of a taster and the general directions. And in the presentation, I'm going to talk about some of the distinctive features of the WHO guidelines. For those of you that are familiar with general clinician guidelines, you're probably not aware of some of the distinctive features and some of the new directions in the guidelines. So this is a summary of the distinctive features of WHO guidelines. So we have a particular focus on low and middle income countries. Our target audience is national program managers, and we very much adopt the public health approach with simplified and standardized approaches rather than the more individualized approach with multiple treatment options. And we use the GRADE methodology, so looking at multiple dimensions. So this is a summary of the actual methodology and process. So we start really with a research question and then defining the research question in the PICO format. And we then commission the evidence, and we look at not just the evidence, but looking holistically at the assessment of benefits and harms, looking at the preferences of the patients, the community, healthcare workers, looking at resource use, cost effectiveness, and then the acceptability. And then looking at all these dimensions, that is used to formulate the recommendation and to then grade the certainty of evidence. So we have the strength of the recommendation and then the certainty of evidence as shown below. So we have a very large guidelines development group. We also have an external review group. And what's very important in the WHO process is addressing and being very transparent about conflicts of interest, be they academic or be they financial, and to ensure we have good representation from all regions and a gender representation, as well as combining both clinicians, researchers, civil society, including those with lived experience, and Ministry of Health representatives. And in this guideline, we lay particular emphasis on having those program managers, because it's the Ministry of Health that are the primary sort of implementers. So this is a quick sketch out of all the reviews and evidence pieces that fed into the guidelines process. And for those of you who have not been exposed to a WHO guidelines development group, it's a vast amount of work and a vast amount of data and a vast amount of discussion, as it should be. So there are around 15 systematic reviews that looked right across the panoply of the use of non-invasive tests, the who to treat, looking at both natural history stratified by the viral load and by the ALT, as well as then looking at cohorts and randomized trials of treatment versus no treatment stratified by the viral load and the ALT. We looked at also dual therapy, that's the use of tenofovir 3TC or FTC, and also the positioning of TAF and a systematic review on that. We looked at point-of-care viral load, reflex viral load testing compared with non-reflex, and for the first time looking at delta testing, so a systematic review, although the data was very sparse. And then finally, to look what we could find on models of care. We also commissioned modelling, looking at different scenarios and treatment criteria and what the impact would be in different regions and a number of sample countries. We also, CHI, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, did an excellent job on landscaping, looking at the Hep B diagnostics, the Delta serology and molecular tests, and TAF and dual therapy. And then the Hep B Foundation with the World Hepatitis Alliance and some partners, and Charles Ampong from Ghana did a great review of the community perspective and the literature on stigma and discrimination. But we had surveys among healthcare workers, pediatricians, Ministry of Health program managers, and importantly, the community. So, as I think Fumi shown on an earlier slide, the need for the Hep B guidelines is really that we continue to have major gaps in testing and treatment. And so the quest to further simplify and make the testing and treatment more accessible. In addition, the hepatitis B guidelines had always been perceived as somewhat complex, and there had been some movement in different directions with other professional society guidelines. And of course, the background rationale being the increasing recognition about the ongoing integration of Hep B during infection and the oncogenic potential. And we were very much following the lead of HIV that's had this progressive simplification over some 15 years. And then with hepatitis C, we had a much more compressed time period over 8 years with 4 iterations of the Hep C guidelines. And really the quest to do the same for Hep B, maybe not in one giant leap, but as a next important step forward. And then finally, also the acknowledgement in the new guidelines, the need to acknowledge some of the regional differences. And given that, 60 million infections are in sub-Saharan Africa, recognizing the specific challenges in that region, and that in sub-Saharan Africa, there's still a significant rate of mother-to-child transmission, and it's those perinatal infections that contribute to the chronic infections. And in those settings that there's often very no or low uptake of Hep B birth dose vaccination. And the very high birth rate in that region means there's a significant proportion of the population less than 20 years. And so for mother-to-child transmission, you have, and I was struck when in the early stages of the guidelines development, 25% of all Hep B surface antigen positive in Africa are in those less than 20 years, compared to China, for example, with their highly effective vaccination program, including birth dose, where there's very few. I think also recognizing the access challenges to Hep B DNA, which obviously in professional society guidelines is an absolutely integral part of determining eligibility, and the need for us to recognize other routes to access treatment that are not dependent on Hep B DNA. Well, this is a summary of what the guidelines, the key areas across the continuum of care for the recommendations in 2015, covering the staging, the who to treat, the first-line treatment with only those drugs with a high genetic barrier to resistance, that's tenofovir and entecavir, and then strategies for monitoring, including, importantly, for HCC screening every 6 months. And then finally, we had a specific guideline in 2020 which addressed the use of antiviral prophylaxis to prevent mother-to-child transmission, a conditional recommendation for those with a viral Hep B DNA above 200,000. And highlighted in red were those particular thresholds that we felt needed to be re-looked at. What you have there on the left is the algorithm for the overall approach to who to treat and who not to treat, and then the algorithm on the bottom was the one we use for antiviral prophylaxis. So the pink part in the middle was addressing who of the pregnant women should have antiviral prophylaxis, who should be treated for their own health, and who would not require either treatment or prophylaxis. So these are the main new directions, and you will, in due course, in a couple of months, and hopefully in March at the Apostle Conference, hear the very specific recommendations. But the direction of travel is really a significant expansion in the criteria for treatment with lower APRI score and a Hep B DNA threshold now to 2,000. Expanding treatment to be offered to adolescents, particularly, in a sub-Saharan Africa setting. So that's a new direction. And then the consideration of dual therapy. And that is partly an issue, a pragmatic issue, that in many settings the tenofovir monotherapy is not registered or widely available in the country, but the dual therapy is, because it's used for PrEP and for HIV treatment. The expansion of the eligibility for PMTCT, recognizing that lack of access to Hep B DNA meant in sub-Saharan Africa, very few people were getting antiviral prophylaxis because they couldn't access Hep B DNA. So some relaxation of that approach. And then just as we did for the hepatitis C guidance, the use of the point-of-care viral load and reflex viral load testing to really speed up that part of the cascade, and then looking for the first time at more simplified service delivery. So the big focus going forward is really on who to treat rather than on who not to treat, and the inclusion of all age groups, that's the adults and adolescents, which means women of reproductive age, be they pregnant or non-pregnant, so young women, adolescents as well. And that's really allowing a common entry point for treatment. And hopefully it will mean, particularly in those settings where that's very relevant, that many more pregnant and non-pregnant women will be on treatment for their own health and not just starting prophylaxis and the stop-start that would happen with multiple pregnancies. 4 options for meeting treatment eligibility. It's or, so you can meet all of them or just one of them, and capturing a much higher proportion of those who are Hep B surface antigen positive. It was previously around 20%, and it's now up to probably around 60%, maybe 70 to 80% in Asia. And applicable to all settings. Only one of the criteria requires access to Hep B DNA, and a big focus is everybody getting an APRI score done. And so those meeting that eligibility wouldn't even need a Hep B DNA. So this is what the 2015 looked like, and most of it is taken up by defer and monitor, whereas the algorithm on the right really is predominantly all about who now qualifies for treatment, with only that thin little line down on the right, which is the defer and monitor. I'm going to skip over this. I think this was one of the systematic reviews looking at the viral load, but the main message here, we had very little data, less than 2,000 or even 2,000 to 20,000. And, I was certainly astonished by the paucity of data and why these cohort studies and intervention trials have not yet been done. And I think the blue table on the right just highlights the very useful way of presenting information as numbers needed to treat to prevent one liver-related death, one case of cirrhosis or HCC, and how many more you need to treat, those less than 2,000. It doesn't mean there's no risk less than 2,000, but it's much, much, much lower. So service delivery, just to finish off on, and, I'm in a unit at WHO, treatment and care, so I have HIV colleagues, STI colleagues, and I'm constantly borrowing and using, and having come from the HIV world, all the strategies that we've learned from scale-up of ARVs. There were relatively few, in fact, no comparative studies of different models of care, and very few interventional studies have been done in HIV on strategies to promote adherence or retention. But we did a systematic review looking at Hep B, and then we brought in all the systematic reviews from HIV that were relevant to the interventions. These are the types of models we saw, many more hospital-based models, because that reflects the lesser maturity of the Hep B response, that there are fewer decentralized models, but there were some integrated, co-managed models emerging. And I think a key message is that these when we looked at these models, that there were some excellent models, and these were in no way confined to high-income settings, with some really innovative and high-performing models of care in a variety of low and middle-income country settings. A key message was, and this is a traffic light that's really looking at what data these various cohorts had across the cascade of care, with the red showing where there's no data, the green where there's data. So the early part of the cascade, numbers tested, none linked to care, we had moderate level of data, but data on adherence, data on viral suppression, data on retention in care was very sparse. And these are core measures of quality of care in HIV. And this is to give you a snapshot of what we were seeing in terms of the cascade of care and attrition across the cascade for hospital models, primary care. And you can see these very significant attrition rates. And this is a key message. We really have to do much better on the monitoring, promoting adherence, promoting retention in care. And again, borrowing from HIV, the many strategies that we've learned. And these are simple, low-cost interventions for adherence support that we now need to bring in to the hepatitis B space. So just to finish, what are the kind of obvious implementation challenges and priorities as we move to substantially expand access to treatment? And that is case-finding strategies. Every national program needs to have a well-thought-through approach to, be it community-based testing, nesting into HIV to really expand access. There needs to be much more community education and awareness, just as has been happening for hepatitis C in those high-burden countries, and training the healthcare workers. And this is just a summary of the online trainings, covers both B and C, as well as some of the mapping of the tele-mentoring and ECHO platforms, which really are superb. And the wonders of WhatsApp or WeChat, as Jidong Jaya was reminding me, you know, really excellent way to support those at peripheral facilities. And then the opportunities for cost reductions for Hep B medicines and diagnostics, and CHI with their recent market report and launch in May 2023 of $30 per year for tenofovir treatment. So really, no country should be paying more than that, and that's a very useful benchmark. We still see a lot of variation across countries in diagnostics, so a lot more work to be done on that. And then I think, as Fumi was alluding to in her earlier presentation, it's not just about the guidelines, that it's all the other levers we need to pull to really propel a national response. And we've really got some way to go with hepatitis B, but it's the community engagement, it's the negotiating prices, and all the standard procurement strategies we've learned well from HIV and to some extent with hepatitis C. And I just want to acknowledge the many colleagues at both WHO and some of you in the room, the Guidelines Development Group, the External Review Group, and all the reviews and the modelling that were done. And we hope to launch these now at the APASL conference with country engagement and participation in civil society. Thank you.